Hello, my name is Graham Bullock, and I am a professor of political science and the faculty director of the Deliberative Citizenship Initiative here at Davidson College. And it is my extreme pleasure to welcome our friends both in person and online to tonight's Expert Roundtable on balancing equality and unity, the case of immigration and citizenship. This event is hosted by the Deliberative Citizenship Initiative, which is now part of Davidson College's new Institute for Public Good. And it is the first of 4 roundtables that are a part of our American Values Deliberative Forum series, commemorating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. This series is co-hosted with Duke University and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And it's designed to both elevate and deepen our conversations about our values, our history, and our public policies. In fact, a group of UNC and Duke students are together right now at a watch party at Duke, joining tonight's event. So, hey guys, good to see you. Glad you can join us. And we'll also be organizing a watch party for the next roundtable that UNC is hosting on October 30th. And I believe a group of Duke students are going to go down to UNC and join their event then. This is also the 20th forum that the DCI has hosted since 2020. A nice round number. And our goal for all of these forums is to model respectful dialogue across differences on contentious and controversial topics, to foster greater understanding about both our areas of agreement and disagreement, and to create spaces for listening, sharing, and coming up with new ideas together. So this year, to provide more time for our panelists to engage with each other, and for our participants to talk about the issues that the panel discusses, we have split the expert roundtable and the community conversations into 2 parts. So tonight is the roundtable, and next week will be our community conversations that we very much hope that all of you will join. So we'll be hosting some here, both Duke and UNC will be hosting some on their campuses, and we've also invited other colleges and universities, K-12 institutions, faith communities, and other civic organizations across the country to host their own community conversations, building on the conversation, again, that we'll hear tonight. To join the DCI's conversations, you can sign up at this QR code or at the link in the chat for those online. And the primary time is next Wednesday at 7 p.m. right here back in the 900 room. And we'll have roundtables out here as well as our DCI trained facilitators on hand to moderate small group discussions of about 6 to 7 people. If you can't make that time though, we'll have other times available. So click on the times you are available in the survey at that link, and we'll contact you about a time that is available, that you're also available. So we have a special guest tonight, President of Davidson College, Doug Hicks, here to make a few remarks to help us introduce our series and share a few insights about the importance of deliberative citizenship, public discourse, and the public good. President Hicks has been a strong supporter of the work of the DCI since arriving at Davidson, and even moderated a roundtable just like this last fall. So please welcome President Hicks for some introductory notes.
Good evening, everybody. How are you doing? Special shout out to my friends at UNC and Duke. The last time I was at a watch party at Duke when I was a divinity student there was in Cameron Indoor Stadium for the 1992 Duke beat Michigan. I assume it's a different vibe there on campus, but special thanks to President Vince Price and Chancellor Lee Roberts and their teams for being a part of this partnership initiated by Dr. Graham Bullock at Davidson College. It's great to take the work of the Deliberative Citizenship Initiative to partner institutions and great partners across the state. So I'm so enthusiastic to be here to welcome our expert guests. Thank you for being on campus and for being a part of this work. And I'll introduce my Davidson colleague in a second. It is such an important moment for the work of building the public good, for learning how to deliberate, and to treat each other as equal citizens. Tonight's topic, what does membership look like, and how do we welcome and show respect to those who are not formal citizens, or how do we struggle with that question of migration and citizenship, such an important topic. We are living in a very discordant moment. We've seen even a killing on a college campus, Charlie Kirk, a few weeks ago. We've seen debate flare up after that about what it means, what are the limits of free expression? How do we show respect to each other as living equals and in death? Lots of challenging discussions and important discussions for us to work on together. The DCI and Davidson have been working on this for a long time. It goes back to our deepest roots. And so we're honored that the Institute for Public Good is now a way to bring those conversations together across civic engagement, deliberative citizenship, ethics, policy, and leadership, and indeed the arts and public life as well. And we'll be building that program up as we go. I'm happy to share with you what to me is a very exciting announcement about the next event after the follow-up discussion to this event. And that will be on October 13th at 7 p.m. in the Duke Family Performance Hall. We're fortunate to have two special guests in conversation with one another, Senator Thom Tillis of North Carolina and Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota. They'll be having a conversation on public good in a divisive time. That event will be open first to Davidson students, staff, faculty, and faculty emeriti. No, I do not have ticket information yet, but we will have it, and we will expect a full house. Two sitting senators, one Republican, one Democrat, interested in finding common ground. I just now want to pass the program on to these experts and want to thank my colleague, Professor John Wertheimer, who's the William R. Keenan Jr. Professor of History here. And his work deals with equality and unity. And he's drawn student researchers through his coursework and through research into important work, including publications. And John, thank you for leading this discussion tonight. Thanks.
Thank you, President Hicks. Thank you, Dr. Bullock, and the students of the DCI who put this event together. Welcome to all of you. There are seats available, especially up here. So if you don't want to stand for the next hour and a half, you can find a chair up in front or interspersed. I teach history here at Davidson. It's my honor to serve as moderator of this panel discussion. And I want to introduce the discussants here. Danielle Battisti here teaches history at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, has written extensively about the history of U.S. immigration. Philip Cafaro is a retired philosopher from Colorado State University, and his research centers on environmental ethics and other kinds of issues, including how many is too many, the progressive argument for reducing immigration. He'll talk about that. Joshi, an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Arizona, is here to my immediate right. His work explores ethical questions related to philosophy, politics, and economics, including immigration, as we'll hear. And then Fernando Tesón, an emeritus legal scholar from Florida State University, and a leading authority on international law, humanitarian intervention, and freedom in its various guises, including the freedom of movement and immigration policies. For the next hour or so, these panelists will discuss three things, starting with foundational values that underlie immigration debates, and then moving on to how these values have played out over the course of U.S. history, the idea is to provide a theoretical basis for the discussion that will follow, which is a discussion of immigration now in our own time. But we want to work on the values stuff first. After that, shortly after 8 o'clock, we will open things up for questions, and there's at least one microphone up here, and we'll also be taking questions online. But we'll start. I'm rushing through this because I really want to hear from our panelists, and you don't want to hear any more from me. So we'll start with the underlying values. Here is the framing that the DCI organizers asked the panelists to consider. As Graham mentioned, next July 4th, the United States will celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence with its famous proclamation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And ever since, those words and the notion of equality that they convey have inspired Americans and others in ways that sometimes have been contested, but have always been important. 11 years later, in 1787, as the nation transitioned from the aspirational ideals of independence to the practical governing framework of the Constitution, another value emerged as a top priority, that of national unity. The Constitution, after all, opens not by echoing Jefferson's emphasis on equality, but by asserting a sense of shared purpose through the words, we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, etc. So unity, equality, these two seminal moments in American history remind us of the importance of considering both of those core values, the nation's egalitarian founding principles and the need to promote a unified national identity. So before we get into the specifics of the immigration debate, I'm going to ask each of you to reflect on these underlying values, equality and unity, just for a couple of minutes each to form a basic approach to our eventual debate. We'll start here with Danielle.
Thank you. And thank you for all of our hosts at Davidson for inviting me. And thank you all for coming and watching tonight. It is a big deal to give up your time and to engage civically with issues like this. And it's important. So thank you. When I sort of prepared some thoughts on this issue, I thought back to what I do in my immigration and ethnic history course at the University of Nebraska. And we go from the colonial period to the present in that course. And one of probably the first central question we think about is, how do Americans in this brand new nation with a limited, short, diverse history, because many Americans at the beginning of the country were migrants themselves, right? How do they come to understand, define Americanism in a new country? If you take a look at previous models that elites or individuals with some pull had to draw upon in this country, they couldn't really use those models, right? What did it mean to be French or English? These are ethno-racial definitions of Englishness. How one looks, what language one speaks, what religion one practices. Your family can trace back roots X generations to a particular place of land, right? And that's not available to people in the United States in a settler colonial nation, right? And it's also not really what emerges when we see people at the time who are thinking about this concept talking about. People like Crevecoeur, de Tocqueville, Jefferson, people I'm sure you've read in your classes. They're trying out something new. They're talking about something new. And the model that my students tend to settle on that they see emerging in this early republic, and I think there's a central tension between an ethno-racial component of Americanism that's always pulling at this other sort of model that emerges, is one based on civic nationalism, right? That you can be an American if you believe in the ideological principles of the Enlightenment, that form the basis of the American Revolution, that form the words in the Declaration of Independence, that form the foundations for the Constitution. And, we see this in the writings, this notion of relative equality of all peoples based on democratic citizenship, and that anyone can become that, right? Or most anyone, because there is definitely a sort of ethno-racial pull that's glaring right at you when people are talking about these things. And so we sort of see unity coming out of the idea that equality is open to all citizens, all potential future citizens. If you take a look at some of the earliest laws governing migration, they're relatively open, right? Relatively open migration policies, relative ease of naturalization, a 2 to 5 year residency period, no citizenship test based on knowledge of civics. The idea is it will come to you. Many migrants are afforded the right to even vote before they naturalize. This holds for a long time in some states. And so I think this sort of idea of Americanism based on civic nationalism is what kind of sticks out in my mind. And I'm sure we'll have time to talk about the tensions inherent in that.
Yeah, so I'd also like to start by thanking Graham for the invitation to come here and Ruby for keeping everything organized. Thank you for doing such a wonderful job with that. And thanks to you all for coming here. We were asked to reflect a bit on unity and equality in general terms and how that might relate to immigration. Two very important values. Probably if I asked for a show of hands, no one would say that they were against either of those things, generally speaking. But, you have to balance values out. If you talk about unity, you have to also talk about diversity. One of the things that proponents for more immigration tend to talk about is the fact that it brings various kinds of diversity to the United States, which it does. And many of us see great value in that. On the other hand, there's a tension between unity and diversity, or there can be. If you're bringing in too many people at once, perhaps you undermine a certain kind of unity around certain values. So that's a tension that many people see in the immigration issue. Equality, hard to say anything too succinct about that, but most of us in this room, I hope, would support the idea of equality before the law. So that's a kind of equality most of us can get behind. If I asked you how important is equality of wealth and income to you, we would instead, I assume, see much more of a variation on that. Some people, Bernie bros like me, we need more equality of wealth. Other people feel equality of opportunity is sufficient, and people have their different views. And regarding immigration here, I would just point out that, we can't lose sight of the economic factors driving immigration and immigration policy. So I would argue that for the past 5 decades or so, immigration policy has been made in the United States to benefit the wealthy, to benefit capitalists and employers, and it has been an important factor in driving growing economic inequality. So I think that's something that should be part of our thinking as we think about immigration. But that depends on a more general judgment about what a healthy amount of economic egalitarianism is in a modern Republican democracy.
Thank you. Rishi, equality, unity.
Okay, great. Can people? Okay, good. All right. So yeah, again, I want to start off by thanking everybody for this great event. I'm going to just say a few things about just equality and how it ties to the constitutional values, and I'm going to try to set these up in a way that's relevant to immigration later on. So All right, so if you look at the Declaration of Independence, it starts with this thing. It says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." And then it goes on to say, "Legitimate government rests on the consent of the governed." All right, so you might ask, well, who should govern us on this view, right? Who's governing us really? Then if you look at the Declaration of Independence, they're reacting to this sort of distant monarch, King George III, and they're saying, well, we don't want to be ruled by this unaccountable monarch out there. So what's the alternative then? Who's supposed to govern us? I think the answer is meant to be we the people, right? That's who's supposed to govern us. Of course, we don't govern directly. There's no direct democracy, but we govern through our representatives. But the democratic ideal is that we are all authors in some sense. So if there's a law out there, who's the author of it? Well, technically, it's the staffers of whatever that maybe they finished it up midnight before it was due or whatever. That's the reality. But in theory, at least in ideal, it's supposed to be all of us, right? So we're supposed to be the authors. Okay, so in a democracy, we submit to laws and norms that we, the citizenry, come up with. Right, but of course, now not everyone's going to agree with all the laws that are enacted. So there's this sort of tension here. So we're all supposed to be the authors of these laws, but of course we come to disagreements about various issues. Am I going on too long? Okay. Let me stop there, and I'll say a few things afterwards.
Yeah, and these are prefatory remarks, and we will pick up on them. These are
Yeah. All right.
initiating threads. And then just initial thoughts from Fernando about equality and unity.
Hi, everyone. I want to also join others in thanking the organizers for inviting me, organizing this wonderful event, I think, and the whole series of panels, I think is a great idea. So when I was asked about think about the values first, the values that we're asked to think about are unity, equality and unity. I would have chosen a different pair, namely freedom and equality, and not unity. The notion of unity is a little bit strange to me in terms of justifying any liberal democracy. But I'm going to talk about it now. It's 2 minutes because I've been told to talk about it. And I think Danielle hit on a very important idea here. One thing of them in the United States that is everybody knows characteristic is we in the United States are not bound by a race or a religion or a color of our skin or language. A lot of the language is English, but we are not joined civically by what I would call an ethnic trait, right? So what is it? In what sense can we talk about unity in the United States? Not, I don't think, in the sense, or maybe I don't want to go into history, but not in the sense that we're Abraham Lincoln in keeping the unity of the Union around the issue of slavery. That was a different concern. In the founding era was the concern of unity, like the 13 colonies against the outside world, the young republic, not committing the mistakes that the Articles of Confederation, the previous union, had committed. But I think morally, it pays to think about unity of the United States as allegiance to a certain set of principles. As Danielle said, maybe we don't call the principles of the Enlightenment or the principles of what I would call a constitutional democracy, right? And so what makes us Americans, yes, even an Argentine like me, an American, is our allegiance to the principles, let's say, for brevity, of the Constitution, with a big tent, as Philip mentioned, about how to interpret the different principles like equality and so forth. Before concluding, I say that this idea of unity, I think, provides me a policy prescription for immigration. And that is, I suggest, all of those who come here pledging allegiance to the principles that constitute our American unity, and those are not race, religion, language, it's allegiance to a set of democratic, liberal democratic principles, are generally welcome. Those, on the other hand, those of you who are planning to come to be predators or with criminal intents or things like that are not that welcome. So that is what I draw the line. A great welcoming that I hope we're going to be able to talk about later for the first group, and start talking about immigration restrictions for the second group, those who do not pledge to allegiance to the principles that make our American unity.
Terrific. Now let's, as we move closer to the debate at the end, let's take these considerations of the values that we've just discussed generally and contemplate how they have played out at certain moments in American history. And I leave it to you to decide which moments in American history you would like to discuss. They could be immigration history, but also some others that the DCI has suggested include things such as the New Deal, the debates over slavery, or the debates over the Equal Rights Amendment, just as examples. So again, just a few minutes each to preserve time for the debate later on. And out of fairness, let's go in reverse order, starting with you, Fernando. You can pick up there.
What do you want me to talk about now?
History.
I don't know anything. History in relation to these values, or history in relation to immigration?
These values, no, especially equality and or unity as they play it out. And it could be debates over immigration
Okay, very
from the past.
So I do think that the first thing, as Phil pointed out, that we need to figure out, and it's hard, is the meaning of equality. And equality, as he pointed out, we can talk about equality of opportunity, which I think was the original notion. Although I think historically, the original notion, and the historians correct me, of equality was we are equal in the sense that you, the Europeans, the monarchists, were not. We don't have privilege by birth. And that was a big step. We don't think about that as a tremendous step in history. So the first historical notion of equality is equal citizens and not a division between aristocrats, monarchs, and the others, and the commoners, right? So this was a big deal, as somebody pointed out, in America at the beginning. The other notions of equality that follows the also quintessentially American equality of opportunity. And then more morally follows the notion of equality of resources, of income or resources, which is, as you pointed out, more contested. I think that the idea of equality of resources is contested for two kinds of reasons. One is empirical reasons. Those who reject the enforcement of equality of resources point out that that kind of enforcement impoverishes everyone at the end. So that's one reason. And the other reason is there are empirical reasons to think that the more the state tries to make people equal, the less equal it becomes. So there are a number of issues that makes this contested. About unity, I've already spoken.
Very good. Hrishi.
Okay, great. I'll try to be briefer this time.
Oh, you're good.
Okay, yeah. So I had some similar thoughts as Fernando did. So, I mean, one way to see American history, and I'm not going to, apologies, I'm not going to talk about specific time periods, but one way to see American history is sort of like enhancing the scope of equality and getting from what we may call from just formal liberties or formal rights to more robust liberties and rights. So start off with, if you think about feudal society, we had the formal liberties. So do you have the right to own land, right? That was only had by the lords in Europe and not the peasants and serfs. So in America, we sort of said, look, everybody can have certain formal rights. Of course, that started off with a small set of people, and then that expanded. But eventually, you might think, so so consider, so let me just illustrate this distinction. I'm a philosopher, so this is what we do, distinctions. So imagine you have everybody has a formal right to become a doctor. So imagine, okay, so before we have this system where, let's say, only men can become doctors. So that means women don't have the formal right to be doctors. Now you say, okay, well, everybody can become a doctor, anybody who can apply. But imagine medical school costs like $400,000. So now here, everybody has the formal right to be a doctor, but in this situation, unless your parents are rich, you're not going to become a doctor, right? Because they're not going to be able to afford the tuition. Or you might consider the right to vote. Say everybody gets the right to vote, but certain areas you have to like wait for 4 hours to get your vote in. Well, everybody theoretically has the right to vote, but that right means different things to different people. So, so now we have, I mean, in the case of medical school and coming to a prestigious college like Davidson, you get financial aid. So that's a sort of a way to make this right not just formal. It's not just like, hey, anybody can go to college, but we're going to give you the robust ability to go to college if you're meet the criteria. So one way of thinking about American history is sort of moving from just sort of formal rights to more robust equality of opportunity and more what I call robust rights. So I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you. Bill?
Sure. So you asked us to delve into history a little bit. Let me apply that to your value of equality. So if you value economic equality and you look at the course of 20th century American history and up to today then, so 125 years, what you see is sort of a curve. In 1900, we see very high levels of inequality, the height of the Gilded Age. And then with the coming of the New Deal, you have policies put in place, including immigration policies that help decrease economic inequality in the United States. And you have a period of 40 or 50 years where we really create the first middle-class nation in the world. And then since that time, over the past 50 years or so, we've seen a steady rise in economic inequality in this country. So that's how that worked. To relate this to immigration, at the start of the 20th century in 1900, we had, for the most part, an open door policy. If you could come to the United States, you were in. There were some exceptions to that, but that's largely how immigration worked, at least from Europe. So we had the highest numbers of immigrants coming in our history. That helped keep wages low for Americans. Once immigration was drastically decreased in the 1920s and for the next 4 or 5 decades, coincidentally or not, that coincided with unions being strong, wages going up, inequality going down. Since we again reformed immigration policy in 1965, immigration numbers have exploded in historical terms, and inequality has risen. Again, those policies have been made to benefit the wealthy, not common Americans.
And Danielle?
So I think I largely agree that if I think about a period of relative equality and unity, I'm probably going to go toward the mid-20th century. I probably disagree on some of the conclusions about the role that immigration policy play in that equation. I think if we take a look at the mid-20th century, this is a period in which historians refer to it as the consensus era. This one historian, Wendy Wall, dates it from about the New Deal to the rise of the civil rights movement. And her work suggests that unity is achieved in large part through Americans being united against common enemies. In this era, this is a period in which the United States is pitting our values of democracy and liberty against fascism and communism, or totalitarianism as it's called after the war. And it's also a period in which the vast majority of Americans are united against the idea of unregulated, unrestrained industrial capitalism, being able to sort of call all the shots in the country, right? This is a period in which the vast majority of Americans get behind FDR's definition of liberty, meaning economic security. A period in which the government is helping to ensure a robust regulatory sort of market, industry, where growth comes from some public sector intervention in the marketplace, support for labor rights. And it's a period in which there's investment in the citizenry. And so that sort of period peters out for a variety of reasons, both domestic and global, and immigration certainly part of the story, but not the entire story, by about the mid-1960s. But it is not a coincidence for me that this is a moment where we get a major piece of immigration reform happening in 1965 on the heels of this consensus era. That kind of change can only happen when many groups of Americans are sort of on the same page with some of these conversations about major forces shaping our society.
Terrific. All right, we're going to be moving into the debate about immigration. But first, I can't help myself as a natural devil's advocate just to respond a little bit to what we've heard so far, and that no one has mentioned what things that seem important to get out on the table, that the United States is not as egalitarian in its history as some of the presenters have suggested. No one has mentioned the 1790 Nationalization Act that restricted naturalization, that is becoming citizenship, to free white people, or the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s, the national origins immigration restrictions in the 1920s that favored some kinds of people, disfavored other kinds of people, excluded entirely other kinds of people. So that's, and then no one has mentioned slavery, which when you're talking about equality and how we were born in this equal nation, it's such a glaringly obvious point. Probably didn't need to be said, but I have just said it, so there it is. And the other point is, and I understand that Phil's exactly, is immigration fell in the mid-20th century. Economic equality rose, and then as immigration increased, economic equality fell. And Danielle is right to say that it's more complicated than just immigration. There were lots of other things going on as well. But I think there is a correlation there, and that's important. But you could make you could shift the frame and say, even as immigration results in more economic inequality within the United States, it actually ends up making for a more equal world. Poor people come to the United States historically, and they become less poor. There's a compression around the world. So a question is, how do you understand citizenship? What do you care about? Anyway, those are 2 points that I wanted to make before turning things over to each of the panelists in turn to have, I hope, brief enough discussions or descriptions of their general stance, maybe explaining their disciplinary perspective about immigration, so that we can preserve time to have a little bit of a back and forth before we open things up shortly after 8 o'clock for questions from the audience. And in this kind of random way of ordering things, we'll start here with Hrishi.
Okay, so I'm currently working on a book project on immigration, and so I want to just set it up in the following way. So you might think, okay, if you really like equality, what should you think about immigration? You might think, well, for some of the reasons you were saying, maybe we should want an open borders policy or an open immigration policy, as Fernando was sort of alluding to. Okay, but I want to just start off with this idea of, look, so consider a situation of roommates, okay? So imagine you have roommates and you have a house, and lots of things are done in common, and it's going to matter to you, and we're all going to be interested in who our roommates are. So imagine you're deciding together, and that's what democracies would decide together. What chores, so in the case of roommates, what chores are to be done? Are you going to have loud parties? Are you going to do drugs? Are you going to study more? What kind of situation are you going to? So you're going to be interested in who the other roommates are. You can think about this in a range of associations. So when I was in grad school at Princeton, I was in this food co-op. So we cooked basically daily, and you had this kind of rotation and so on. In any kind of association like that, it matters who the other people are. Now, okay, and yeah, just to talk about this institution here, Davidson College. So institutions like this set their sort of admission policies. I looked up Davidson College, and apparently it has a 14.5% acceptance rate. So congrats to all the students who got in. Okay, but the country is almost, you might think it's even more important than these associations, because hey, if you don't like Davidson, you can apply elsewhere, you can go elsewhere. If you don't like your roommates, you can move out. But David Hume, the 18th century Scottish philosopher, once wrote, "Can we seriously say that a poor peasant or artisan has a free choice to leave his country when he knows no foreign language or manners, lives from day to day by the small wages which he acquires? We may as well assert that a man, by remaining in a vessel, freely consents to the dominion of the master, though he was carried on board while asleep, must leap into the ocean and perish the moment he leaves it." Basically, so the countries are much more difficult to exit in this way. Second point, political power is coercive. So when the state comes to you and says, pay your taxes, it doesn't say, hey, would you kindly pay your taxes? It says, pay your taxes or you on pain of imprisonment. So laws are coercive. And now who are the authors of these coercive laws? It's other citizens. So then we have an interest in determining who the other citizens are. And because where we live dramatically affects our life choices. So whether you live in the USA or North Korea or Denmark or South Sudan, your life is going to go very differently. So we have an interest. So what I want to say is we have an interest in generally what the public culture of our countries looks like. And I think, I mean, yeah, so I'll stop soon. I think that grounds the democratic right of the demos to determine conditions for entry. This need not mean we need to be like super restrictive or anything, but it really ought to be up to the demos. And how do we decide what the policy should be? I mean, hopefully more conversations like this. So thank you.
Thank you. Danielle.
As an employee at a public university, I'm going to keep my own views kind of to myself, but I'll reflect a little bit on historically how we have governed immigration. Historically, immigrants have been welcomed into the country on the basis of family unity, on the employment needs of the country, and on humanitarian grounds more recently with things like refugee and asylee policies. Now, what should the formula be in determining factors like that? Should there be other factors? Should we amend those factors? What should the numbers attached to each of those categories be? These are reasonable conversations for our civic leaders to have, for all of you to weigh in on. Some of the underlying notions that undergird many of those categories that I outlined are the notion that ties that bind are important, right? That we create bonds of community through family. We create bonds of community through workplace. We create bonds of community through civic religious organizations that help the other. And so I think in thinking about principles behind some of those categories, a legal scholar, Hiroshi Matamura, who writes his prescriptions on what he thinks we should do to reform immigration laws, talks a lot about the importance of affiliation, that every newcomer should be made to felt as though they are creating bonds of affiliation with citizens in the country. And so I think some of the categories we have historically used can do that. And I think the idea of being inclusive with the newcomer, whatever the formula or number that you want to make that cap that at may be, is something that's useful for us to think about.
Fernando.
Yes, I cannot help to respond to some of the things that have been said and express my disagreement. I think the first idea that I think I would challenge is the idea expressed by Phil, and I think endorsed by our moderator, that this seems like an argument, proto-argument, that says that immigration is a problem because when we allow immigrants, the economy improves, this is absolutely, I mean, nobody denies this. This isn't something I think that is well established. The economy improves just by application of common law of comparative advantage and labor economics. But that is maybe a problem, says Phil, because it might create increases in inequality, because the ones that improve the most are the wealthy. So he suggested that immigration laws are at the service of the wealthy, because when you admit the immigrants, the economy grows, and also there's inequality that grows between rich and poor. I think that this argument, with due respect, is based on a philosophical mistake. And the philosophical mistake is the idea that the most important moral characteristic of an societal arrangement for society is the gap between rich and poor. I think this is a false idea. The most important thing, I think, in a liberal democracy concerned with the poor is to improve the lot of the poor, not to reduce the gap between poor and rich and poor. This was argued by someone left liberal like Rawls has said this, although he changed it a bit later. And I think about it for a second. I think what Phil says is true, that when we get all these immigrants, the economy improved enormously. And it's also true that the rich are the ones that improve, but the poor improve too. The immigrants, why do you think people keep coming to the United States? Because they are improving. Of course that the wealthy improve more than the poor improve after when we accept productive immigrants. But it's a good thing that the economy improves, provided, I insist, that the poor improves. So we have improved the lot of everybody, and it's true the gap has increased. But I submit that the gap is not important. The important thing is that we take care of the poor improves. And the poor improves when the cake grows, the economy grows, and industries blossom, and so on and so forth. Before I shut up, a brief point, Rishi's point about this idea that the demos, the electorate, has the right to decide culturally how its demos, the society, going to look. I don't think this idea can be implemented, is a defensible idea, especially in a country like the United States, where we all have different cultures, we all have different religions. The only idea, I think, that we're entitled to impose is the idea that underlies democracy, the great principles of the Enlightenment, the great principles of the Constitution. And this is where I shut up.
Very good. Phil?
So let me start by defending Hrishi's idea that the demos should decide. And let me tell my fellow Democrats in the audience, we haven't taken that seriously over the last 3 elections regarding immigration, and we've helped elect Donald Trump twice. So even if you don't believe the demos should decide, the demos is paying attention, and they've spanked us on this issue. But I think the demos should decide. I think in a democracy, broadly speaking, public opinion should make a big difference in terms of what policies our representatives put forward. And that hasn't been happening. I think it needs to happen. Another aspect that Hrishi brought up, I liked the metaphor of choosing roommates for a house you're living in. That makes sense to me. I think even more than the people that you bring in might be just the number of people that you bring into your house. So if you're looking for 4 roommates and you wind up with a dozen, that might not be a recipe for a successful and sustainable house. This gets to some of the writing I've done around the issue of creating a sustainable society in the United States. and the argument that you really aren't going to be able to do that with an ever-growing number of people. In 1900, we had about 76 million people in the United States, according to the census. Today, we have 340 million, and we're on track to have somewhere around 550 to 600 million by 2100 at current fertility and immigration rates. That is not sustainable, which is one reason for decreasing immigration, I would argue. Two more quick points. One, I totally agree with Danielle that whatever number we agree to, I think people who come to this country, who we bring into this country, should be welcomed. And hopefully that's a place we can all find common ground on. I hope that's the case. Last point to Fernando's argument that a rising tide lifts all boats, or that immigration has been good for everybody. That's just not true. To take one example of many, if you go back to 1970, slaughterhouse work in the United States provided good middle-class wages and supported millions of families in the United States. Today, on average, according to the Bureau of Labor, I don't know if they're still collecting statistics there, but when they were last year, today, slaughterhouse work in comparable terms pays about 45% of what it did in 1970. Those are your fellow citizens. That's the demos. Those are people who used to vote for Democrats. So a few things to think about.
Thank you all for laying things out on the table. That's terrific. Do you want to respond to each other in any ways?
I've just a couple of thoughts. Yeah, so one, and I don't think I agree with, I don't think I disagree with Fernando in theory. So what Fernando is saying is like, look, suppose you have, Margaret Thatcher once said this, but she was arguing against the socialists. She says, you rather people be here rather than here, right? So here there's more inequality, but you don't want, you're an inequality fetishist. Like you just, I just hate inequality, right? So then you don't care about the worst off. You just have this fetish about equality. So she said, you rather people be here or so than over here, where even the lower person is better off. Now, I think in theory that's very compelling in a certain way, but so if I may say so, you might not be interested in inequality, but inequality is interested in you. So what does that mean? There's a fairly robust sort of data that the more inequality you have, is that where the genie goes up is more inequality.
Yep.
As the genie goes up, all the bad political things happen, all of them, so there's more political instability, there's more, pick all the bad political things, they go up with the genie. So I mean, in theory, actually, I mean, I find this compelling. I'd rather people be here than here, but here is how you get instability, and you got to watch out for that.
I'll jump in with another voice from history that weighs in on this discussion that we're having, and it's probably not a name you think I'm going to mention, but in my research, I've encountered the writing of Pope Pius XII, writing Exsul Familia in 1952. So this is a Catholic encyclical, and the Pope was pushing back against both the United States and the Soviet Union, who are in different ways restricting migration. And the Pope is writing about how God created Earth and man and all the resources on it, and man's right to support man's family through a relatively equitable share of partaking of the world's resources, and that nation states only have the right to restrict migration and access to those resources to the extent to which it ensures, I'm trying to paraphrase here, the good of humanity, not one's own country, right? But come on, geopolitical realities butt up against that all the time. The realities of democratic participation in electing officials butts up against that all the time. And so, you know, we could all bring up our names of people who are working through this in different eras and at different vantage points. And there's ideals and then there's realities, right? And I think what we need is sort of the conversation about some of the realities, right? So if we go to the reality of economic life in the slaughterhouse, you can counter, well, you know, this can be improved through things like regulation of the industry rather than a reduction in immigration or something. And so I don't know that I'm making any real point except, you know, I think what we need is a push for our lawmakers to actually have the conversation about the realities on the ground. And I just want to also introduce, we're talking abstractly about immigration policy without mentioning things like enforcement issues of that immigration policy, which are very much on, I'm sure, all of our minds right now. Sort of national security concerns, diplomatic concerns when it comes to crafting immigration policy. And so I'm sort of curious if any of the other panelists have thoughts on those issues as well.
Fernando?
Yeah, well, okay. I think time for a conciliatory note. I want to say that I agree on the question of the roommate argument that there are issues of sudden disruption. Like you pointed out, Phil, with the numbers, I think I agree with that. And we don't have time to discuss the details of what would be a sensible, if I was up to me, very liberal, very permissive immigration policy, but with the adjustments needed to avoid disruptions, like all of a sudden you want a roommate and you get like 12 families coming with, no, of course, I agree with that. I also think the argument about environmental, the problem that you're an expert on that, that's a separate argument. That's not the same argument that we talked about on the question of inequality. So to say just those things. Just to reiterate my view is that the one thing that we have not talked about are the rights of the immigrant. The right, if we have a global view about human rights, about that people have rights by the virtue of being human beings. The immigrants have the right of freedom of movement. They design their own life plans according to their own rights. They want to come from Mexico to Arizona, and they find armed guards in the border that prevent them from doing so. I would say, at the minimum, that you should have a very good argument to actually justify that. Somebody who
I think I've got one.
peacefully wants to come across the border to engage in productive behavior across the border and improve himself, herself, and her family. So I stop there.
So I would just say the argument is you can't preserve the modern welfare state with open borders. I mean, it's just not possible in the world we live in today. The Gallup organization every year has their world poll across most of the countries in the world. And one of the questions they ask people is, do you want to emigrate from your country? And in the most recent poll, it was somewhere around 900 million or 950 million people around the world want to leave where they live for economic reasons, whatever reasons they have. Many of them want to come to Western Europe. Many of them, over 100 million, specified that their primary destination, if they could choose, would be the United States. So that's the world we live in. You can't allow that kind of and still preserve a viable state that's going to be worth living in. That would be my argument against a general right to immigrate wherever you want.
Joshi wanted to get in, and then Danielle.
Oh, just wanted to just quickly say, You know, Milton Friedman once said that you can't have open borders with a welfare state. So there's a agreement between a Bernie bro and Milton Friedman, you know. The other quick point I just wanted to make is, and this is, you know, yeah, so I'm writing a book sort of responding to this kind of point, which I find very interesting. So there's this idea, it's mostly usually from libertarians or classical liberals, that people have a freedom of movement across borders. I think our society presupposes that our rights to free movement can be limited by the rights of others. And I think one simple case is property, right? So property, you have you have a house. I can't come into your house without your permission. So property already presupposes, and what's going on there? It's not that I don't have a right to free movement. It's that my right to free movement is limited by your right to property. And now you can ask the similar question about countries. Do countries have, it's not exactly property, so I don't want to get tripped up on property, but property is a set of rights, including a right to exclude. Do you have a similar right that countries have to set there? And it's not just property, by the way. It's like, you know, you can't go to the gate of an airport without a boarding pass, right? It's sort of, so we have these limitations. Then the question, the real question is, then do countries have that kind of right?
So
Danielle and then Fernando.
I'm glad I waited
no.
because what I was going to say is historically, even if we go back before the origins of the welfare state in the United States, it's the Chinese exclusion cases in the 1890s that establish on the basis of plenary power, which is the idea that nation states have the right to exist and control the boundaries of their territory, their citizenship, their national security, that nation states have the right to legislate immigration. This is the same basis historically for the right to deport as well. So I think that's the legal term you're searching for there. And so I'll just end it there. And if, you know, we want to respond, that's fine.
Fernando?
That I can blatantly begs the question, because what we are questioning is precisely the extent of the supposed right to exclude by the state. We are fetishizing the state here with these kinds of arguments. In fact, if I live in Phoenix and want somebody to cross the border from Mexico and mow my lawn, let's say, the state interferes with my property rights by not allowing a free agreement between the immigrant and me for labor, for services, and puts the armed guards that prevent the immigrant from implementing this voluntary agreement of mowing my lawn. So it's the other way around. The analogy with property works exactly contrary. It's exactly against the argument, the nativist argument that everyone seems to be defending at this stage. I think that on the question of that's a genuine question. I think the question of the welfare state, it's a genuine concern, and I think it's the most powerful argument to restrict immigration. I don't think all the other arguments work for reasons that I've said in the book, but I think that's a good argument because it's true. There are people who have incentives to free ride on our welfare system, and those people, if they have their incentives, at least some of them will. Immigration advocates, among which I count myself, have given answers to that. That, for example, designing the immigration law to eliminate that incentive. And for example, telling the immigrant, come be my guest. You want to start a taco stand here? Be my guest. Be happy, you and your family. Perfectly fine. But if you fail, no welfare laws for you. Or something like that. I'm not saying, this is not about policy, but all I'm telling you, Phil, is that there are a number of responses to that. It's not that people have not responded to that.
But Fernando, if I understand you correctly, then you're willing to weaken the welfare state in that way to get the benefits of open immigration. Is that a fair statement?
I didn't say that. It's an unfair statement.
Okay.
Okay. For independent reasons, if I had my own, if I were the king of the world, yeah, the welfare state as it works, it's better to do away with it. But I'm not making that argument.
Yeah.
My argument is not the welfare state is bad, so it has to go, and therefore immigrants in. If you want to keep your welfare state, keep it. And there are ways, as she said, with respect to immigration, as Danielle said, there are ways to actually neutralize the incentive to free ride on our welfare system.
Yeah, that's the claim. But if you look at how these things actually work, we increased immigration starting with the 1965 Act and starting in the 70s and gathering speed in the 80s. The meatpacking industry broke the unions in that industry, and they brought in a lot of foreign workers, and they locked out the workers who had been working there. And as a practical matter, the state did not step in and solve all those problems. And, it's probably unrealistic to expect it to, because the same government that was happy to see unions broken isn't going to turn around and say, we're the champions of the workers. I mean, this gets into the mistakes that the Democratic Party has made in evolving from the party of the working class that my parents grew up with to the party of well-heeled professionals like the people on this stage. And, that might have been good for us. It wasn't good for our country. And the bill is coming due on it now.
Hrishi wanted to say something before we go to questions, but soon thereafter, we're going to have some. So we'll hear from you and then we'll open things up.
Oh, yeah. Just very quickly. I mean, I wanted to respond to the, that's a really good case with, how the property rights come in tension with the states, the states kind of stopping people. Or you want to invite someone to, I don't know, mow your lawn or something from somewhere, and then the state comes and like stops them, and so that's violating your property rights. I think one thing that I think needs to be said further though is that there's an externality, right? So in the economic sense, so if the person who comes and mows your lawn, let's say they break their leg or something, who's get if you internalize the externality, then you would have to pay for their health insurance, right? But if you don't,
you were talking about the demos not allowing the immigrant, and now your argument is that there's an externality, someone's going to break a leg. You cannot keep moving the target like that,
I'm just saying in general, the property rights. Yeah. Anyway, I'll just stop there.
Yeah, that's it.
All right, let's have a preliminary round of applause for. And Graham, did you want to give a little something about the ground rules for the question and answer period?
Yes, so we're going to now open it up for Q&A, and friends in person, we have a microphone over to the left if you want to stand and start creating a line there. I wanted to just let you all know that, all of us in person, we actually have over 150 people online with us. Friends online, we have about 100 people in the room right now. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go back and forth between our in-person questions. And then also my colleague, Dan Lehman, professor in philosophy, and also a co-convener of the DCI, is going to be curating questions from our online friends. And I will kind of go back and forth between the two of you. And what we ask is that you keep your questions relatively or very brief, and that they're actually questions, not statements, so that we can get to as many questions as we can. So, and so why don't we start? And
We're bouncing back and forth one and one.
Yeah, so we'll go back and forth.
Can you give Dan a microphone so he?
Yeah, we got one over.
All right. So okay, we're ready to go. Thank you, Graham. First question.
Hi, my name is James Quest. Thank you for having this. I wanted to ask, what was your opinion on the United States having the ability to exclude certain people? Anyone on the panel?
Are you talking about historically or right now?
It could be either or, because like the Page Act, back when
So
they
you're
had
talking
the
about
Chinese Exclusion
Specific
Act.
groups of people.
Well, those specific groups of people that were excluded for a certain reason because they were believed to hurt our nation. So I wanted to ask you, do you believe the United States should have the right to exclude anyone? And if so, then how do you view the vetting process that we have to do in order to have legal immigration?
I could take a stab at that. I mean, I think in general, I don't see I don't recognize a right to immigrate, right? So I think that's a privilege that the US government or governments around the world can grant or withhold. And we can do that for whatever reasons we decide are good reasons. We should make that decision politically and democratically. In terms of whether it would make sense to allow certain groups in or not, I don't know, maybe you're thinking in terms of national security reasons or something like that. You know, I think it's reasonable that there could be certain groups that might be more dangerous than others, but I think that's a difficult path to go down, and we should think very hard before we start going down that path. I think we should
So
be.
just to be clear, you're saying there is no vetting process? We should let anybody come in?
Oh, the opposite.
No, I think a reasonable vetting process, you know, but understanding that most of the people who want to come to the United States want to come for perfectly understandable and reasonable, you know, non-injurious reasons. They want to better themselves. They want a better life for their families. But a reasonable vetting process, sure.
Fernando wanted to get into.
No, very, very briefly, to answer to the gentleman. International law gives an answer to your question, which is that any country can exclude anybody for almost any reason. So already the laws and the laws of the different countries, constitutional law and the exclusion cases, which are for a number of reasons they are rejected, but the basic doctrine remains that the United States can exclude anybody can close its borders. It could not do it for racist reasons and things like that. But other than that, it can do it. My own point is that all that is unjust.
So to understand what you're saying it's unjust?
That power, absolute power to exclude is unjust. Yes, I do believe it.
Thank you, James. And let's move on now to our online question from Dr. Lehman.
A question from our online participants. At least since slavery, the link between immigration and labor has introduced a hierarchy that challenges unity and equality. Can the panel talk a bit more about how labor contributes to these tensions and colors who is welcome? For example, labor of skilled workers is now in vogue. They are welcome, but others are deported.
Danielle?
I don't know if I would approach the question the same way. So the question is saying that labor usually presents an anti-immigrant position?
So I believe the question is policies about labor, about what kind of labor is privilege, creates tensions, internal tensions, and as the questioner says, colors who is welcome, like what kinds of prospective workers are welcome under immigration policy.
I guess what I would say to that question is that one thing the United States has historically done is since about 1952 started to select for some streams of immigration based on labor that's deemed in need to grow our economy. Sometimes that can be skilled labor, sometimes that can be unskilled labor. What I think is unproductive is when the United States does this on the basis of guest worker programs rather than immigration visas, because then those guest workers are placed in a secondary citizenship status. They are much more prone to coercive treatment by their employers, and there are many more rifts created between them and native-born American workers. Whether or not you think that employment needs are a good basis for governing immigration, you know, that's a matter for us to debate.
We've got a long line of people here, and I apologize in advance to the people who are waiting online and there. We'll do as well as we can. Let's try to
Sure.
keep our answers brief.
No, I love you started out with American values like free speech, free religion. I'm sorry that that one of you feels like your free speech is hampered by being in a public institution. My question is, so I'm sorry. My question is, we used to hear a lot about comprehensive immigration reform, make it easier to be legal, but harder to be illegal, and let folks, you know, the amnesty, that sort of thing. I haven't heard about comprehensive immigration reform since 2007 and Kennedy McCain. Is that even talked about anymore?
No.
Okay, that was a quick
was
answer.
quick. Go
So
ahead,
we
Danielle.
were having dinner before with students who were asking similar questions, really great questions. And, you know, I sort of steered students back to a conversation about bigger structural problems that are preventing productive legislative conversations right now. I would cite things like Citizens United and electoral college reform issues.
Yep.
To get at the root at some of why these conversations aren't happening.
All right, so here's a question about special responsibilities the United States might have in light of their own actions. So someone writes, what responsibility should the US have towards immigrants that come from nations that have been destabilized due to foreign policy and US intervention? Has been the case, as has been the case in many Central American countries.
If you believe that the United States should have a restrictive immigration policy, but should make an exceptions for the kinds of folks that you're talking about, if I were that kind of person, I would say, yes, absolutely, it should help. But I'm not that kind of person because I think everybody should come in. So it applies only to restrictivists.
It's an excellent question, and it sort of comes down to what kind of basis do you want to ground American foreign policy in, right? If historically we had prioritized things like anti-communism in the 20th century, then your answer to that question is going to be no. But if you think that you can make the best sort of foreign policy delivery, or I guess the foreign policy that you want to shape America's image in the world, then yes, I think there is moral responsibility, economic responsibility. Have we seen that happen? Not necessarily, right? And more recently, the way that we have handled some deportation issues to countries that were initially adversely affected by American intervention, prompting an outflow of people here, we've sort of seen that problem compounded.
Question.
So this question is actually somewhat related to that question, a little broader. And sorry, it's a little long-winded. I tried to make it as succinct as possible. We somewhat discussed the tension between global social responsibility and the state's responsibility to its current citizens. The United States has a unique position as a global power that pushes for its values on a global scale and plays an outsized role in global politics. With that in mind, do you believe that unique position should alter our immigration policy to reflect a higher priority in global humanitarian well-being, as opposed to just the well-being of our citizens?
You get the question?
Yeah, I mean, I would say no. I would say we need to be realistic about the fact that the American people are very skeptical that their government is working for them. And immigration policy is certainly one area where that policy hasn't been made to benefit us, but there are many others. And at this time in particular, I think it's reasonable to ask questions about what our global responsibilities are, but I do not think that we should be making immigration policy based on anything but a calculation about what's best for American citizens. And again, I hope time isn't running out for us to get that right. It sounds great that we want to make immigration policy based on comprehensive global responsibilities. But in a country where we've been failing to stand up for our own workers, it's a mistake to continue on down that path.
Does anybody else want to jump in on that? Let's move along.
All right. European nations, for example, Germany, France, and England, are struggling with immigrant non-assimilation. How do you secure the unity needed in a democratic republic when the lack of assimilation negatively impacts cultural unity?
I think you have to look at some of the policies that some states put in place that welcome or exclude newcomers, and then sort of assess how that impacts immigrant non-assimilation. And how do you define non-assimilation? In a state like Italy, where I do a great deal of research, citizenship is not extended via birthright. The children of immigrants are not even welcomed into the nation. They have to apply for it when they turn 18. So I think that that conversation just needs to get complicated a little bit more, right? There's a couple of ways that we could approach some of the problems that do result from immigration. It does tug at national unity. Are those problems surmountable? Yes. Are there a variety of solutions to them? Yes.
All right.
Hi, I had a question for Professor Philip Cafaro. So you mentioned that the sheer number of immigrants coming in could threaten the sustainability of a nation. To that point, what policy do you advocate for then when determining who gets to come in and who doesn't? And if we follow a first come, first serve arrangement, how do you reconcile with the globalist argument that those who don't have the socioeconomic means to migrate as quickly as others are actually the ones who are most in dire need of a better life here in the US?
Yeah, I mean, that gets at a very difficult problem. I mean, I have argued in the past for reducing immigration into the United States. And what that means is that, like today, but even more so, many, many good people who want to come here and make better lives won't be able to do so. And so I don't think there's any way around that. I mean, one way would be to change that position and say, of course, come if you're a good person. I don't think that's workable. So, you know, then if you're talking about, well, whether you're talking about current numbers, higher numbers, or the lower numbers that I want, you still have decisions to make about who to let in. And I think I agree with Danielle that to some degree you should try to accommodate family reunification as part of that. I agree with people who argue that maybe we should focus more on bringing in more highly educated, highly skilled workers. I would support that, because then whatever downward wage pressure you have is on a class of people who can deal with it more easily than poorer people can. But that's a very complicated issue that you bring up.
Anybody else want to get in on that? Oh, Hrishi has a point.
Yeah, just wanted to add that, you know, I mean, yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, there are these surveys, like how many people would want to come, and you said it's something like 900 million. So basically, I want to say, like, unless you're prepared to say like 900 million tomorrow, you're gonna have to make that call somehow, right? You're gonna have to say, well, here's a criteria, and not everybody. I mean, you know, Davidson, right? It has its own criteria, it decides, and then it decides 14.5%. You know, so unless you're willing to say 900 million tomorrow, you have to make the call some way.
Okay, can each panelist prescribe one simple public policy recommendation to move the ball in the direction of their philosophical view on immigration policy in the US?
Fernando?
My policy recommendation would be to talk about the restrictions that I would I think are justified. As I said at the beginning, there should be a policy not to welcome persons who are terrorists, criminals, or other forms of predators, or persons who are intent on harming people in this country. Those persons, now how this raises serious issues of implementation, of course, but I'm not addressing that, I recognize that. I would also, however, add other cautionary restrictions or directions in which the legislation should be designed. One would be, as we talked, some provision to prevent people from free riding on the welfare state that we have in the United States. And a third one that I have not mentioned, or I did mention in passing, is to regulate immigration in a way that it does not cause major social disruption. So I recognize that as something that should be part of the regulation. Other than that, I think, as Phil said, people that are non-injurious, who have goodwill, who want to be productive and improve their lives and their families' lives, should be welcomed into this country.
Yeah, I just think the economics debate around the around the issue needs to be complicated a bit. So yeah, I don't know if I have time to go into this, but yeah, in a slogan, so there was this guy Mike Clemens who argued that like the GDP of the world would double if there was free immigration. There's a lot of recent literature, but it's not really read by many people that has challenged this. So there's an economist at George Mason called Garrett Jones who has made this. He has a great book called The Culture Transplant that I recommend people take a look if they're interested. But that really complicates this idea that the world GDP would double if borders were open. But anyway, I want to stop there.
Danielle?
I guess I would list a robust public campaign to welcome and integrate newcomers, reform of immigration courts, and a very hard look at the rule of law and our enforcement practices.
Thank you. Bill?
And in a bipartisan spirit, I would recommend two pieces of legislation. And both of these are actually, they have bills currently sponsored in the House and the Senate. The first would be mandatory E-Verify for all new hires in the United States, so that we're making sure that when people hire workers, they actually are entitled to be here working. And on the other side, pass the DREAM Act and give amnesty for, I think it's somewhere around 1 million people who were brought to the United States as children, give them citizenship.
Let's try to get all three of you, 1, 2, 3 at the same, I mean, not simultaneously, but before anyone responds, and then they can respond to all of you because we're closing in on the closing time and I want to hear from all of you.
Piggybacking off of that question, I know we discussed the enforcement policy, and I would love to hear your guys's, current, your thoughts on the current concrete practices by this administration.
Right, enforcement from this administration is the first part of the question.
This one's a little bit longer, but I'll try to make it short. The roommate analogy that you all gave, I thought was very interesting. This idea that you wouldn't that you would trust a roommate to upkeep the safety and maybe make important governing decisions about the room, but you wouldn't necessarily trust a stranger to do that same thing. So what I think is interesting is that while I don't know this stranger, I do know my roommates in this analogy. Whereas in the United States, I don't know my fellow citizens and I don't know these immigrants coming in. And so I already don't have a ton of trust and faith in the fellow citizens of this country in a lot of ways. So I suppose my question is, what's the problem with bringing in a couple more strangers into the room in a country of 330 million strangers?
And finally, go ahead.
Were I to take into consideration the arguments that were presented here, say the argument of geopolitics, that a state's primary charge is the security of the country and the prosperity of the country, and on the other hand, the economic safety of the country, I could take the second, economic safety of the citizens, I could take the second argumentation and say perhaps apply it to present times, wherein the president has increased the payment, the fee required for, say, the H-1B visa, right? However, as a matter of consequence of this, there have been many arguments made that this results in the drainage of, say, skilled labor to rivals of the United States, say China. This has also been evidenced by the visa plan the PRC is currently formulating. My question is, where do we find the balance in that? And where is the right answer in that? That's my question. Yeah, thank you.
And we'll use that as a way to allow people to give their closing remarks and framing them, if you can, as a response to any one of those three good questions. Starting over here with Phil.
Sure. So I'll take the gentleman who asked about our analogy or metaphor or whatever it was of the room. I think he brought up a good point. And I would say there's nothing wrong with bringing a few more people into a nation of 340 million. I think there's nothing wrong with bringing in a couple 100,000 annually into such a nation.
Yes.
But at some point, again, we talked about 900 to 950 million people who want to emigrate from the developing world to developed countries around the world. At some point, it gets to be too much in terms of things that are well worth protecting, whether that's a middle-class standard of living for average citizens, whether it's protecting open space in North Carolina. You can have too much of a good thing. Immigration is part of our history. It's a good thing in moderation. Again, just to give some figures, in 1965, we had around 250,000 net migration into the United States. In the last couple decades, it's been averaging somewhere between 1.25 million to 1.5 million. And in 2023, according to the latest Census Bureau figures, net migration into the US was around 3 million people. Absolutely unprecedented. It's too much. Many people feel it's too much. And it's time to ratchet it back somewhat, but not completely.
Danielle?
I think I'll probably respond to the first question. I think that right now we're grappling with a situation in immigration law enforcement that threatens the security of citizens as well as non-citizens, right? We're dealing with situations in which people are being placed in unmarked vans by masked individuals who are poorly trained, perhaps being deported without due process to countries of third asylum. And this can affect citizens as well as non-citizens. And I think we all have to think through those issues.
Yeah, so yeah, let me go back to the roommate thing. Yeah, so the roommate analogy is, yeah, so that's a helpful question. It's not meant to be, yeah, so philosophers, we do this thought experiment stuff, but the idea behind the roommate analogy is that it matters to people, matters to people who their roommates are, it matters to people who their people spend a lot of money to live in certain neighborhoods. So it matters, you all came to Davidson. It matters to you that you're here in this type of institution. So now, of course, the country is much bigger, right? So it's as the person said, you don't know every other citizen, but it matters. I think it really, because as I said, if it's not King George III, who is ruling us? Who's ruling me? It's you all, right? Right? I mean, it's not King George, but it's you all. If you all vote that XYZ, I have to follow that law. So then it matters to me who you all are, right? That's meant to be the idea. Just close with this thing about trust. So yeah, this person also, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but brought up trust. Now here's the thing about trust. You plot on the x-axis trust. And there are many ways to, I mean, the simplest way is to ask people, like, do you think people in your society can be trusted? Which countries have a lot of this? Japan is high. So in Japan, people often say, like, I can leave my wallet in the train and it'll come back to you. So Japan is very high trust. Now, if you plot x-axis high trust, everything good goes with the trust, predicts like all the good things, GDP, everything else. Okay, and I mean, one thing to note after the 60s actually is that trust has kind of gone down in the US. So, and if you read the Garrett Jones book, there's a lot of work there to suggest that trust can travel. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Fernando.
Yeah, I just want to extend a little bit the response to the roommate. It was basically it's a cultural argument. I think it relies on the idea, not on economics, I don't think, but relies on this idea that citizens have a right to have a society that has a certain cultural profile. Well, I don't think that is sensible, right, to have. Cultures change. The United States was built by immigrants. Would you really prefer to live in a society that doesn't have Chinese food, for example? I mean, cultures change, and one of the great, I say this seriously, and my own native country, Argentina, also built by immigrants. I mean, it seems to me that this romantic idea, no, I don't want any, that's burning equality. I don't want to live with uncertainty. I really prefer my old diner instead of this kind of Indian or Chinese restaurant that they put next to it. I think it contradicts, to go back to history, one of the great insights of the founding era already, and that was later ratified by one of the great liberal thinkers in England, John Stuart Mill, the idea of experimentation, of actually that a free society has to live, in order to continue to be free, has to learn to live with the burdens of experimentation and change. And so I think that for that reason, I think that I would not go the way of this idea that we, the citizens of liberal democracy, can impose some kind of cultural homogeneity on everybody, and especially close the doors to outsiders.
Thank you. Grant, do you have any housekeeping before we call it to a close?
I do, a few. And so the first is to just say, when we were designing this forum, this series, we had a big question, two big questions. One is, could we invite a panel that could handle the complexity of the questions we wanted to ask? Those of you who know DCI panels and events from last year, the last 6 years, we focused on one issue at a time, right? We've talked about guns, social media, artificial intelligence, a whole range of different topics, but they've been policy oriented. What we did with this series and our first expert roundtable today is we layered on 2 additional layers: the values piece and 250 years of American history, and a policy question. And I think, this panel did such an amazing job of accepting that challenge and really helping us all engage with each level of that complexity. So I'd like to, thank them all for such an amazing conversation. The second challenge, though, we still don't have an answer to, which was, this was a good, I think, decision to give them more time to take this challenge. They had an hour and a half instead of 50 minutes. But we don't now have time really for you all to talk about the topics. And the decision was to delay those until next week. But I was very hesitant about this. Jay knows this, all the other co-conveners knows this. Because I think it was Hrishi who mentioned it, the demos, right? You are the demos. Right now, only the experts have talked, right? But you all need to be in this conversation. So please come back next week, 7 p.m. right here on Wednesday night. Register at that QR code or the link in the chat. Or we'll find another time for you to click. There's like 30 different options, and we'll try to find an option for you to really engage with these same questions that our amazing panelists did for us tonight. They started the ball rolling, but we need to continue the conversation. And then next slide, please, Adam. The next thing is just to kind of remind you of our next forum on October 30th. UNC is hosting it on their campus on balancing self-government and national stability, the case of presidents, institutions, and the people. And actually, next slide. And I'm happy to announce, I just got this poster from my colleague at UNC, Kevin Marinelli. We can announce tonight our panelists that Kevin has been putting together for that event. We have an amazing panel, starting with the moderator, Kevin McGuire, who's a political scientist at UNC, Thomas Frank, who's a historian, PhD from University of Chicago. You may recognize the name. He's the author of What's the Matter with Kansas? And also a more recent book on anti-populism. And John Gastel is a professor of both political science and communication studies at Penn State. And he's done a lot of amazing work on deliberation and deliberative democracy. And then Jennifer Mascott, who is a professor of law at Catholic University and also has served in both the first and second Trump administrations and was recently nominated to serve on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. So it's I think another amazing panel that I encourage you all to register for, and you can register at that QR code over there through UNC's invitation. So, and if you're in Friends Online, if you're in the UNC area, you can join in person. So last thing is just some further thank yous to our moderator, Professor John Wertheimer, did an amazing job tonight. Thank you, John. To Professor Dan Lehman for synthesizing the questions from our online friends. Thank you, Dan. And then also Adam Barton, who has coordinated all of the digital side of things. And then also Grant Corbett in the back, making sure all the sound and technical things have been working well and smoothly. To Ruby Ave, our DCI program coordinator, who's made all of the sort of logistics and operations work tonight. And then also make sure I've got everybody. And then also my collaborators at UNC and Duke, Kevin Marinelli and Deandra Rose, who are helping organize this whole series across all three of our institutions. So thank you. And then finally, thank you all for being here to engage with this and think about these really important, complex topics that are facing our nation and really facing the world at large. So with that, I want to conclude our event. We do have some food and drinks in the back. Hang out, continue, talk about tonight with your fellow participants. Say hi to some of our panelists. But thank you all for being here. And one more round of applause for our